So, how do you convince an entire civilization to follow the rules? It's a huge question. Today, we're diving into the ancient world's most powerful, most effective answer. You claim the rules don't come from people at all, but from the gods. Let's break down this ancient blueprint for order.
I mean, really, at its core, this is the fundamental question every single society has to answer. Because without some kind of obedience, you don't have order, you have chaos. So back in the ancient world, what was the ultimate tool for making sure society held together?
Well, the answer wasn't debate or voting. It was authority, but not just any authority. The absolute best way to guarantee obedience was to say that the laws, they didn't come from some king or council. No, they came directly from the gods. And when you do that, you put the law completely beyond human challenge.
Now, when we think of divine law, I'm willing to bet one story immediately comes to mind: Moses on Mount Sinai. It's such an iconic image, and it's the perfect place for us to start.
You know the story, right? Moses goes up the mountain, gets the commandments straight from God, and brings them down to the people. Now, the way this whole event is framed is what's really important here. The law is a finished product. It's delivered, not debated. It's an absolute command, and it's presented as this totally unique, once-in-all-of-history moment.
And that brings us to the big question for today. Was the whole Mount Sinai event a radical break from everything that came before? Or was it actually part of a much older, well-established tradition for how you create and legitimize law?
Well, as history shows us, this was a very well-trodden path. The idea of a divine blueprint for society, that was a familiar concept all across the ancient Near East for centuries, literally centuries, before the biblical story ever took place.
This timeline is absolutely crucial. Just look at the dates. The super famous Code of Hammurabi was set up more than 400 years before the time of Moses. This pattern of a god giving the law to a human ruler was already ancient.
And Hammurabi's code is the perfect example. It wasn't just a list of rules carved in stone. Its real authority came from the picture right at the top. You see King Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god, the god of justice, and he's receiving the laws directly from him. The message couldn't be any clearer.
So the crucial point is this. By framing law as a divine command, it becomes totally non-negotiable. To disobey the king's law wasn't just a crime you'd get punished for. It was sacrilege. It was an offense against the cosmic order and the gods themselves. I mean, what a brilliant strategy for creating social stability.
Okay, so if the structure of getting law from a god was already a common thing, what made the Mosaic Law so different? Well, the innovation wasn't in how the law was delivered, but in what the law was about. It's all about the difference between the framework and the actual moral focus. Let's look at them side by side. Both codes use the exact same structural framework. The laws come from a divine source. But look at the content. Hammurabi's code is mostly about practical stuff: business contracts, property disputes, social hierarchy. But Mosaic law, especially something like the Ten Commandments, it shifts the focus completely to ethics, to your relationship with God, and to your relationships with other people.
And that's really the core takeaway here. The Bible wasn't inventing the idea of God-given law out of thin air. It was taking a familiar, existing political tool, the idea of a divine command, and just reorienting it toward a whole new set of moral priorities.
And this same pattern, borrowing an existing structure but changing the content, doesn't just apply to law. It applies to leadership itself, specifically to the idea of a king. In Mesopotamia, kings were seen as the chosen agents of the gods, put on earth to maintain order. Sound familiar? The Bible basically adopts this exact model. Israelite kings are anointed, a sacred act that frames their authority as a gift from God. The logic is identical. If you rebel against the king, you're rebelling against God's plan.
But, and this is a huge but, the biblical tradition adds a crucial twist. While the king's power is sanctioned by God, he is not above God's law. His authority is permitted, yeah, but it's also held in check by that same divine law. The king himself is a subject, which was a pretty major reinterpretation of the whole absolute power model. So, why was this blueprint of divine law and divine kingship so incredibly successful? Why was it so widespread? Well, if we look at it from a sociological perspective, it served a few absolutely critical functions for building and maintaining a stable society.
Let's break it down. First, it creates a single standard of behavior that everybody has to follow, which helps unite people. Second, it just short-circuits endless arguments by making the ultimate authority completely untouchable.
You can't argue with God's law. And third, and this might be the most important part, it shifts obedience from something that's forced on you to something you feel internally. Following the law becomes a matter of your own conscience.
So when we see all this, the Bible doesn't look like some isolated text that just dropped out of the sky. Instead, it becomes this fascinating participant in a very old, very human project, the search for a system of order that actually works. Its real genius isn't in its political structure, but in its moral vision.
Now this raises a really interesting tension. If these laws are supposed to be unchanging and divinely inspired, how does a society ever adapt or evolve? The answer, it seems, is reinterpretation. The tradition wasn't just about adopting a structure, it was about starting a continuous process of rethinking and reapplying that structure's moral core for each new generation.
So, if these grand systems of law and authority are constantly being inherited and reframed, that leaves us with an even deeper question. How does religion make sure that obedience takes root, not just in the public square, but deep down at the level of the individual mind? Now that is a question worth thinking about.